going on retreat is actually just letting nature do its work. It's letting our bodies do its work. It will provide great physical recovery, but it provides emotional recovery. It's going to be the source of amazing mental insights. And it's, more importantly, I find it reconnects us with our spiritual core.
I'm Amy Woodall, and this is The Conscious Habit, a show from the People Forward Network. We're teaching you how to incorporate love and consciousness at work, at home, and the world at large. You just heard from Fabrice Desmarescaux. He's a seasoned partner at McKinsey & Company and the author of The Art of Retreat. He has a rich background in integrating Eastern spiritual traditions into Western management, and Fabrice works closely with CEOs and teams to elevate performance and consciousness. And on this episode, he shares all of his wisdom in spending the last 20 years working with some of the greatest CEOs across Asia. He shares what trends he's been able to witness and what has been true this entire time. And we also dig into his book, and he talks about why all of us should take some time in simply being. Take a listen. Conscious Habit listeners, I am thrilled for you to learn from our guest today, who comes to us all the way from Singapore. So good evening in your neck of the woods. It's early morning here. I'm sure late evening where you are. Today we have joining us Fabrice Desmarescaux, all the way from Singapore. Fabrice, welcome to the podcast.
And good morning to you, Amy.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for adjusting your schedule to make this happen. Whenever we are, interviewing our international peeps, it's always a compromise, isn't it? Of you stay up late, I'll get up early, we'll meet in the middle. So, Fabrice, you have spent the last 20 years of your career doing leadership development, specifically like CEO and executive development in Asia. And I am so interested to learn, how did you get into this work, first of all? And then secondly, what have you seen change over the last 20 years?
Well, so how did I get to do this work? I think I fell into it by accident. I was actually a senior executive myself, C-suite in a bank, running a fairly large consumer banking operation. And at the age of 42, I decided to change careers and go into this field of leadership development. So that was quite a steep curve for me, but that came out of an offer that I received unexpectedly from a large global executive search firm. And they liked what I had done before. They liked the networks that I had in Asia, and they offered me to come and become an executive search consultant. So that was my foray into identifying, assessing, recruiting senior executives. And then over the years, I moved from recruitment to development, coaching CEOs, coaching their teams. So it's been a process of evolution, but it all started when I got a phone call about 22 years ago, actually.
In those moments, were you like, oh, yes, I'm ready, I'm excited, I see this need, or did it take some convincing to move your focus over?
I had absolutely no clue what these people did, other than because of my previous career, I had been at the receiving end of calls from executive search consultants who used to call me and say, hey, Fabrice, would you be interested in this role or that role? So I had been a candidate for some of the executive search firms, but I had really no idea of what was going on behind the scenes. So it was a process of discovery for me, which took some time. So I think all in all, between the first approach and the moment when I started, I think we probably took 1 year to decide. And during that year, I met quite a number of consultants in that firm. I did quite a bit of soul searching, and I looked deep into my roots. When I was, so my prior history before being a banker, I was a partner at McKinsey in the financial services practice. And so I looked at what did I really enjoy? And, at McKinsey, I was always part of the recruiting teams that would travel to the US or campuses. We would go to Chicago, Harvard, all the best US universities to recruit MBAs, and I was always keen to be part of these trips. I was also part of the faculty on our development programs. When we take young consultants and we train them, I was always keen to be on part of the faculty. So I had this love for recruiting and developing young talent, and I thought, maybe there's something there. So it was quite a process of discovery for me, but realizing that I actually quite enjoyed this process. And so I decided to give it a try.
I think it's always interesting to hear people's jump where they're like, I want to start developing people. And sometimes it comes from not great experiences for themselves where they're like, I had some terrible leaders and I wanted to do it differently. Sometimes it comes from the opposite where they're like, I had some great people who poured into me. And so I was fascinated and I wanted to be able to go do that, for other people. But I think it's always interesting how we find ourselves in this place of being a human developer, if you will.
Yeah, and I think there's as many stories as people in that field, but mine certainly was not predetermined when it happened. It was, I would call it serendipity. Now, of course, you can always connect the dots with hindsight, and I had always been interested in that field. I had read psychology and philosophy and human development theories when I was in my 20s. Of course, I had done nothing with it because I trained as an engineer, a mathematician, and then I did my MBA. So I thoroughly ignored my interests to pursue a very conventional career in consulting and in banking. But, life has a way to remind you of your early interests and passions. And for me, it came back when I was in my 40s.
I feel like there's a lot of the 40s for a lot of people seem to be this time where they're like, okay, I did the money thing or the, title thing or whatever the case might be. And they really come back around to, okay, what am I passionate about? What do I want to lean into? What do I really love and enjoy doing? So for the last 20 years in developing leaders, what are the trends that you're seeing maybe shift now and are becoming more important in leadership development? And I'm also curious, what's always true? I think there's those constants where you're like, I don't think this is ever going to change and what's required to be a really incredible conscious leader. But I am curious of what you're seeing on the horizon as well.
Well, perhaps we start with what's always true. For me, leadership is not a job. It's a calling and it's a responsibility. When you're in a position of leadership, you have tremendous power. You have lots of resources at your disposal. You have a lot of influence. And so it is your responsibility to use it for the greater good. And I think that's always been the case. And there's always been leaders who did that. And there's always been leaders who used their positions, not necessarily for their benefit, but to pursue goals that may benefit one category of stakeholders at the expense of the others. So in particular, I think we see a lot of leaders today who pursue the interests of the shareholders at the expense of the employees and at the expense of the customers and the ecosystem at large, right? And I think we can say quite safely today that the modern capitalist system has led to a number of anomalies, including income inequalities, environmental destruction, non-sustainable behaviors, and inconsiderate use of common resources like water, oceans, air, etc. And this is really a byproduct of a capitalist ethics that says there's only one thing that matters, and it's the shareholder value, or by proxy, the bottom line, if you want, right? So I think leaders who fall in that trap do not really do justice to the role of leadership that they've been entrusted with. It seems to me with the 20 years, and actually, look, I started my career almost more than 35 years ago now. So I've pretty much always been very close to the C-suite, even when I was young, thankfully. So I think there's more and more now of this chasing the market cap, chasing the share price, chasing the bottom line than there ever was before. And there was a whole generation of conscious capitalism before, particularly with family-owned businesses, the great families that built the industrial US, that built the industrial Europe, and to a certain extent in Asia, although the Asian history, with the exception of Japan, is probably more recent. But there's been families that took very seriously their responsibility to the community. This has completely disappeared in the world of publicly listed companies. It still exists to a certain extent among privately owned companies, those that are owned by family. Of course, it's completely disappeared from the world of private equity. So any company that is privately owned by a private equity fund will only chase one thing, which is the exit value. So I think there's been a shift from what I would have called the conscious capitalism of, from the beginning of the century, the 20th century, that is, up until maybe the Wall Street years of 1980. And then from 1980, there's been this relentless pursuit of shareholder value. And, exemplified by Jack Welch and building the house of cards that was GE, until it collapsed, of course, as it should. And that was really the absolutely ruthless capitalism. We don't care about the employees. We don't care about the environment. We don't care about the societies where we operate. We just care about one thing, is to make the shareholders rich. And by extension, because of the share option packages that the top executives receive, we are going to make ourselves extremely rich. So that's been a shift. But what is true and has not changed is the fundamental responsibility of leaders to act for the good of the shareholders as well as the good of the whole ecosystem, including, you could say, future generations, right? So we're building today for the generations of tomorrow. That has never changed, but I think there's been a shift in the last 20, 40 years towards just forgetting about everything else except the good of the shareholders.
My hope is that there's a turnaround, even though it may be a slow one. I think that we see that in our own listener base and some of the initiatives for the clients that I've worked with over the decade and a half, of doing this kind of work. There are leaders who genuinely give a damn. And it is about, greater good beyond even, what's happening greater good in the organization, but greater good in the community, greater good and ripple effects for generations to come. And I think for leaders to be able to reflect that, especially for those who may be listening, maybe you are going after some, you're thinking of selling your business. When you mentioned the, private investment firms, how do we have conscious equity in, as we're beginning to sort of expand our businesses or they're expanding their portfolio? What does conscious equity potentially look like? And I think there's a constant ask for ourselves of, am I serving for personal gain or am I serving for greater good? Because one always prevails in the end. It's hard to serve both at the same time.
Well, Thomas Aquinas was always saying, be careful not to worship power or wealth or pleasure or honor. And so the question really is, what God are you worshiping when you're a leader? Are you worshiping the gods of money? Are you worshiping the gods of power? Or are you worshiping God? And I'm not saying this to advocate for any spiritual tradition, right? But I'm saying, what is the greater cause? What is the greater moral cause that you're worshiping? Because there's nothing wrong fundamentally with becoming wealthy as a byproduct of doing something good. There's nothing wrong with that. I don't think we should look at an either or. Either we serve the greater good or we want to fill our pockets with cash. The two are not necessarily incompatible. I think we have a problem when the sole objective is to fill our pockets with cash at the expense of everything else, which is very much, very, very dominant in today's world. There's only one thing that matters, and that's really become worse in the in the years that I've been in advising leaders is today you cannot have a conversation without mentioning the share price, without mentioning profits, without mentioning return on capital. And these are all good metrics. I'm not advocating that companies should go bankrupt because they want to serve, protect the environment or serve their communities. A company going bankrupt does not serve anyone. It's a waste, right? The company is meant to be profitable. The question is, at what cost do you want to be profitable? And what is the limit to the profitability? Like, how many billions are enough to satisfy the shareholders? Because today we see companies that are extremely profitable and at the slightest downturn, lay off employees, for example. We still see companies that are massively profitable, apply unethical pricing policies to squeeze even more out of customers. The question is how much is enough, and do we put limits to the greed, or do we say, you know what, it's okay, maximize profits, maximize shareholder value, continue going full speed in this direction on which we've been for the last 50 years, and let's see what happens to the earth and let's see what happens to the world.
You're mentioning the either or mentality that a lot of people have, right? Like either we give a damn about our people or we make a lot of profit. Either we, only care about people or we go bankrupt. Like this either or mentality is keeping us stuck, and to really open the possibility to also and on the flip side of that, I don't know about you, but the leaders that I have coached personally, if they are chasing money, power, fame, or pleasure, if they are chasing one of the four idols, they're feeling pretty damn empty inside. Not only is there not a contribution to a greater good or a ripple effect, or maybe a contribution to the bottom line, or where the dollars and cents coming from, but internally they feel a lack of fulfillment because they are chasing false idols, to your point. And I like what you mentioned, this combination of also but wrapped with ethics and integrity. How can we have all of these things be true at the same time? So when you look at the leader's responsibility, what are some of the things that they need to be able to bring to the table in order to make that happen in their organization? Also, and ethics, responsibility, greater good oriented, what do they need to be focusing on?
For me, it's the main question is to do our own examine and say, what am I really doing here? So, you talk about conscious leadership, right? So what is it that I'm pursuing? And is this okay? Am I comfortable doing this? And would I be comfortable sharing that with my kids? Would I be comfortable sharing that with my friends? Would I be comfortable sharing that with the communities in which we operate? Because, the world is not black and white. So everyone, to a certain extent, will have some attraction for wealth and pleasure and power and fame. And I think that's part of also what makes us human, right? We're not perfect. We all have our weaknesses. So maybe the first step is to say, you know what? Yes, to a certain extent, we're going to be pursuing these objectives, right? So we're going to be pursuing growth. We're going to be pursuing profitability. We're going to be pursuing shareholder value or market capitalization. But what are the lines in the sand that we draw that we will not cross? What is it that we are okay with doing, and what is it that we're not okay? What are the behaviors that we condone? What are the behaviors that we do not accept? How are we going to relate to our customers? How are we going to relate to our suppliers? How are we going to relate to our employees? How are we going to relate to the societies in which we operate? And look, the world is not completely dark. There are plenty of companies that ask themselves these questions and who are excellent partners in business, that honor their agreements, that are extremely respectful of the environment. And we all come from a place where, for example, environmental considerations were almost non-existent, right? So we've all had to catch up and we've all had to learn. But that's fine. It's continuous improvement process in a way. So I think the point here is not to cast a stone on anyone, is to say, look, whatever the history, whatever has brought us to where we are today, what can we do tomorrow that is responsible towards the shareholders who have put their capital in the business, but at the same time is responsible to the rest of the stakeholders? And that's a very difficult conversation to have for a number of reasons. First of all, because sometimes it's very hard to measure the impact that we have on, say, on communities, on the environment. It's not an immediate equation that we can solve. Also, the shareholders put enormous pressure on the leaders, particularly in publicly listed corporations. Quite frankly, the margin of maneuver of the CEOs is very, very limited. And you've seen that trend, I'm sure, as we've all seen, the lowering, the reduction in tenure of CEOs. CEOs used to be in their job for 20 years, and then it became 15 and 10. And now I think we're somewhere around 3 years, the average tenure of S&P 500 corporation. So CEOs are actually not meant to stay in their job for very long in today's circumstances. And maybe that's an added incentive for them to say, look, I know when I get the job, I don't know when I'm going to be asked to leave the job. And maybe I need to do a big splash. I need to make money very quickly because I'm only going to be in this job for 3 years. So I need to really maximize my stock options. So I need to do something very drastic on the bottom line to push the share price up artificially, because I know that my tenure is going to be very limited. If by the time you become CEO, if someone said, you don't have to worry about anything, you're going to be CEO for 20 years, maybe you would take a very different view. So it's not easy. I'm not advocating that, there's a quick fix to turning CEOs into conscious leaders. I think many CEOs that I work with are actually trying their best to be decent human beings, decent leaders, but it's very, very difficult. And the temptations are many, and the pressures are enormous.
Ladies, imagine taking time away to work on you. Meditation, yoga, transformational work, a chance to have grand adventures and build lasting relationships. Desiree Garcia and I founded High Vibe Tribe Retreats to create just that. And if you're curious about joining us on our next retreat, head over to highvibetriberetreat.com. Link in the show notes. Yeah, I think this is it requires a human, and most people are not leading, Fortune 500 companies. That is a very small sliver of the world, but most leaders are leading mid-size, maybe even smaller organizations. And I think it is a review consistently of personal values. What do I hold sacred? What kind of human do I want to be? What kind of legacy do I want to live? What are the things that I want to adhere to your point, kind of these non-negotiables in behavior? And then how do they align with the organizational values? And what then does that, how do we, hold those things sacred? And what are we willing to give and take on? Because you're right, it's not about perfection. It's not like we're all going to become Mother Teresa, which, by the way, there's stuff coming out about like, hey, maybe she wasn't the kindest human all the time, which is proof of, we're humans. None of us are, live up to the standard of perfection. We're going to waver. We're going to have temptation, to your point. But how can I have a good plan to be aligned to do my best? And I know one of the things that you're passionate about, Fabrice, is in working with CEOs and working with executives is for them to take time to work on themselves, to take time to be, to think, to reflect. You wrote a book called The Art of Retreat, which I love because, as listeners know, Desiree Garcia and I host a retreat, a women's retreat that's for executives and business owners. And it's a time for these women to just be because we're so busy doing. So tell us a little bit about where did this book come from? Was this your own, wow, When I take time away, I feel so much better. What inspired writing the book, The Art of Retreat?
Well, I think the observation is that when we take time to reflect, to slow down, when we reduce the level of agitation, the level of busyness, when we reduce the level of noise in which we find ourselves day in, day out, suddenly new insights emerge. Now, this is not Fabrice inventing a new style of leadership in 2024, right? This has been part of the spiritual traditions for 5,000 years. So there's nothing new, really, about taking time in retreat to gain insights that we didn't have when we were immersed in daily life. Simply, it's become what was something that actually a lot of people practiced, either for religious reasons or simply as a way of life, because those who were in position of leadership, who were usually the ones of the privileged class 100 years ago, 150 years ago, had time to take holidays, to just because, when you were traveling from New York to San Francisco, it would take 4 days. So you would have time to process everything. Today, we live at such a pace, the opportunities to be constantly connected are there. So the cost of taking time off, of turning the phone off, of being unreachable, that cost has increased. And so it's become very difficult for leaders to really take time in silence and in solitude to gain the insights that maybe 50 years ago or 100 years ago, they would have had natural opportunities to do that. So now we need to, in a way, make a deliberate effort to create these pockets of time, of privileged time where we can actually be on a retreat. Because if we don't block the time in our calendar, it's just not going to happen.
And what do you say? Because I hear this constantly. Even us in doing these retreats, we will have people say, I just don't know if I can take 5 days. I don't know if there is sort of this fear. And it's definitely happens in the US. I'm sure you see it other places too. But in the US, there is this like, go, go, go. Even when you're on holiday, when you're on vacation, it's sort of like, I'll do my best to respond, but I'm so sorry. It might take me 3 hours. I mean, there's sort of this fear of being away. And so I'm curious, how much time do you recommend? Is it like you could take a few hours, or does it need to be days? And how do people justify the time away? I'm a believer that they get far more back than what they're going to give in that time. But I'm curious about those two things. How much time and how do they justify?
Yeah, so that's a very, very good question. How much time really depends on where people are in their development. So for people who've been just busy, working, and living that life, I usually recommend that they try some experiments, right? I never tell people what they should be doing. I suggest experiments, and I say, look, you try it for a week or 2 or 3, and then let's have another conversation and see if that worked for you. And so I usually recommend that they try for a couple of hours. So I say, whenever the time works for you in your calendar, whether it's on a Friday afternoon or a Wednesday lunch or a Monday morning or Monday evening, whatever, work with your assistant and ask your assistant to block the time and put some bogus, appointment, meeting with the nomination committee of the board or some BS like that nobody's going to dare touching and that looks very legitimate, right? And take 2 hours, disconnect the phone, be alone, preferably don't stay in the office, go somewhere where you're going to find peace of mind. So it could be go to the park or go to the beach if it's nearby. Stay at home in your garden. Whatever the space is going to make you feel calmer and you're not going to be interrupted and you can be alone for a couple of hours and see what emerges. See what thoughts come up. Process your experience. Review the week that has just passed. Let it sink. Don't try to achieve anything because there's nothing to achieve. I think we need to let go of our attachment to outcomes, right, with these retreats. Sometimes nothing will happen and you will just have spent 2 hours of quiet. Your metabolism is going to slow down. Your heart rate is going to slow down because you're not constantly checking your messages. So there's nothing wrong with doing that. But most of the time, when we start quieting down the noise, we start slowing down the agitation, and we stop the constant stimulation of messages and calls and meetings and Zoom, etc., and travel. And we can finally be in a quiet place for even just a couple of hours. A lot of insights start emerging. So I suggest to my clients that they try that. And they try that for 3 weeks and then let's have another conversation. And if you thought it was a complete waste of time, then fine. We'll speak again in 5 years.
I think there is the practice of being feels so foreign to people, and especially those who are high achievers. And let's face it, a lot of people who find themselves in an executive position or even entrepreneurs are high achievers in some form. And it feels, there's sort of this voice within, which we had a guest on, Laura Hyman, a while ago, who called it the bitch in the attic. And, the little chatter within that says, you're being lazy. There's so much to do. You're letting people down. This is useless. This is where. And I think even your suggestion of do baby steps, just a couple of hours. And the goal is just noticing, right? Is that what you're saying? Notice, be curious. You can be introspective. You can review, but it's not about having this, okay, I'm taking this time and I have this set agenda and here's what I'm looking to accomplish and I need to have this clarity when we're done. It's letting go of that. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I also believe that most of us have had those experiences. So it's not like I'm introducing something that is radically new that no one has ever experienced. A lot of leaders I work with, they say, when I go on holidays, every day I go for a walk on my own. Or sometimes on weekends, I go with my spouse and we go walk in the forest and we don't need to speak. This is an extremely regenerative moment for me. It's fantastic, right? And so I think there's very, very few individuals who have not experienced the power of being alone or in silence, in nature, alone with their thoughts, to process what's happened, to develop their self-awareness. I think we've all experienced it. It's just that we block it out. But this is very natural for human beings to be doing this. We've been doing it for centuries and centuries. It's just that the evolution of the corporate world with that technology that was supposed to make our lives easier has actually made our lives miserable. And we're slaves to technology. Heidegger was warning us against that in 1954. So fast forward 70 years, and he was right. We are slaves to our technology. It's not the technology that is our slave. That would be okay. It's the other way around, right? We're slaves to technology. We're slaves to the pressure of delivering results, and it's getting worse. So I think we've blocked our natural inclination to alternate between moments of intense activity and moments of recovery. Athletes do that very well. Animals do that very well. Actually, in a lot of professions, the people do that quite well. But in the corporate world, somehow we seem to be performing 24/7. If you look at stars of, singers and performing artists, there's a performance and then they rest. And then there's another performance and then they rest. Maybe they go and tour the country for 2 and 3 months, and then they will take 3 months off. Not that they do nothing, but, it's this constant cycle of high intensity recovery, high intensity recovery. That's a very natural cycle in human physiology, and we completely ignore it in the corporate world.
We definitely do. And that's why there's more burnout there than anywhere else. And you're right. If we just look around us, there's great examples of that live everywhere. If we look in nature, that, the season change even, there's times when there's a time for rest and, a time for rebirth. And we can't outrun our own human nature. We cannot outperform our own human nature. And so we need to find those times to honor it, to connect with it. And in the end, we are better for it. And I know that you really advocate for this with your clients. When you and I initially did our first just kind of like check in, let's learn a little bit about each other before we scheduled the podcast call, you mentioned that you have a home that you like to sneak away to. It's your sort of respite. And you may take clients there. But in your experience of doing these things, both personally and with clients, how does this help them? The first part of our conversation has really been around being more conscious in our leadership. How do we serve a greater good? Not that we have to fully sacrifice ourselves, but that we can be more conscious of the effects that we're having as a whole. So in taking these retreats, how do you feel like that allows us to be a more conscious leader for that greater good?
The retreat is a space. It's a gateway, if you want. Right? It's a gateway to greater self-awareness. It's a gateway to our inner journey. When we're busy and in a noisy environment and constantly under pressure, we're just blocking out this inner life that we have. We become numb to our emotions. We become oblivious of our inner life, of our inner compass, our guidance, because there's just too much pressure and we react to the outer pressures. So we disconnect from our inner compass, if you want, which is why under pressure we can do all kinds of stupid things because we're not taking the time to reconnect with ourselves. But I'm a big believer in the fact that we all have this inner compass. We know when we do something wrong. We know. We don't need an external moral guide or judge or that tells us, this is not right. We know. Simply, we're very good at numbing our insights into ourselves, numbing our emotions, numbing our feelings, numbing our physical sensations. And then, of course, when we can't do it anymore, then instead of going into a period of recovery, we will use coping mechanisms like drugs, alcohol, sex, whatever, to just compensate for the lack of recovery time. So going on retreat is actually just letting nature do its work. It's letting our bodies do its work. It will provide great physical recovery, but it provides emotional recovery. It's going to be the source of amazing mental insights. And more importantly, I find it reconnects us with our spiritual core. So I'm not saying take 3 weeks and go into a monastery and shave your head. Although maybe that would help. I don't know.
It could be fun.
It could be fun, right? But take 2 hours every week. Take a week every quarter. And look, if you're a leader, by definition, you should be able to do that. The position of leadership should give you greater freedom. If you've become a leader to have less freedom, then why are you doing this? You should have the freedom to decide on the best use of your time. You should have the freedom to decide what is the best course of action for your company. And you are the judge to decide what is right and what is it that you want to do for the good of the company, but also for the greater good. So that is what's being a leader that we seem to have forgotten somehow.
I just want to reiterate to leaders that Fabrice said 2 hours a week, 1 week a quarter. And I think to allow those times to reflect with you, because my gut says many of you just heard that time and you're like, 2 hours a week, I don't know, a week a quarter, we get 2 weeks vacation here in the United States. But I think to allow that to really sit with you and to say, what would happen if? And Fabrice, I love that you mentioned the spiritual component, because mind, body, spirit, that stuff is integrated into everything that we do. And I do think, at least here in the US, like we're getting more on mindset, being more mindful, but that's only one component. The mind is actually the last thing to kind of collaborate. The spirit speaks first. The body then keeps the score of whatever is happening there, right? And the nervous system reacts. And then the mind acts in alignment with whatever state the nervous system is in. And so while I'm so happy that we're doing this mindset stuff, to Fabrice's point of these retreats and these opportunities of being, it's a reset for the body and the spirit. And of course, the mind as well, but we can't forget those other two components.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Look, in a way, when we go on retreat, we transition from the world of doing to the world of being. And the world of being is holistic by definition, right? It's being in the body, being with our emotions, being with our thoughts and our cognitive processes, but also being with our spiritual core. And when we're in the world of doing, we're practically only governed by our brain. So we become completely disembodied, right? We lose track of our spiritual core, and we're just a cognitive machine, left-brained, looking at numbers and micro-optimizing numbers until, we fall dead because it's exhausting. It's not satisfying. No one gets any joy from optimizing the numbers to death, right? Particularly when these numbers are completely abstract, like, what do you tell your employees? Get out of bed and be inspired because we're going to make billions for our shareholders. That's not very inspiring. What is the purpose for which we're going to work, right? So we need to reconnect with that spiritual core. And I think a retreat is the ideal setup to do that. Again, I haven't invented anything. That's been for thousands and thousands of years. We've always alternated between these cycles of being, in the world, doing, being active, and then taking time. It's this cycle. We take time off and we reflect. We resource, we re-energize, we reconnect with ourselves, and then we are ready to go back into the world. So there's nothing wrong with being in the world. We need to do that. And not everybody has the vocation to become a monastic, right? So I'm not advocating that we withdraw from the world. We have to be, as leaders, we have to be in the world. But we need to do this cycle of moving forward and stepping back once in a while.
I think it makes us, there's so many folds of that. It's like, we will be happier humans for it, for giving ourselves that space and for refilling. We will be better leaders for it because we'll be able to see things with a clearer vision rather than that reactive state that you mentioned when we're kind of in this, panic and we're just go, 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 do. And we'll connect more effectively to others because we can only connect truly to others in a way that we're connected to ourselves. It's kind of an us first, them second. I'm not saying put them second, but we can only give what we have. And so I think there's definitely an all-around effectiveness to just practicing this ancient practice of slow down and take some time for being. And as we wrap up today, Fabrice, taking retreat, is one of the pieces we mentioned. Are there a couple other, just for leaders who are listening and they're like, I do want to be more aware of my effect on the world outside of me, the world outside of our business, even the ripple effect that we're having. I want to be a conscious leader. What are a couple of other things that you might suggest for them beyond retreat that they could be doing to help honor that?
So there's a few, I don't want to call them micro practice because they may be a bit more significant than that, but easy practices to get started on the path of self-awareness. One is journaling. So taking 5 minutes, 10 minutes max, but I really encourage my clients to not overdo it because it has to become a regular habit. So it's better to do 5 minutes a day than 1 hour a week, one day at a time. So 5 minutes, first thing in the morning or last thing in the evening, sit down with your notebook and jot down what's been happening for you. What are your thoughts? What are the regrets that you have for the day? What have the sources of satisfaction? What are you grateful for? And there's many ways we can journal, but I'm always happy to journal a little bit on what am I grateful for and maybe what I would like to take again the next day that I didn't quite finish today. So journaling is one. A short meditation practice is also good. Again, start with 5 minutes, maybe 10 if you have the time. Then you can increase if you get into the habit of meditating. But start small. Just sit quietly in the posture of ease and dignity, and close your eyes and bring your awareness first to the breath and then to the physical sensations. Just noticing the thoughts, but not attaching to them, just letting them go. So it's not about, I cannot meditate because I get distracted all the time. Yes, I know. So do I. It doesn't matter. It's just the process of witnessing. Meditation is witnessing. It's not about creating an artificial vacuum in your brain where like you're, brain dead for half an hour. That doesn't work like that. So that's two very simple practices. I find that a lot of leaders actually exercise. There's much more consciousness about physical health. And so a lot of people go to the gym, they run, they bike, they do sports. And that is maybe not as withdrawing from the world as a time of retreat would be, but there's so many benefits to going to the gym. You put your headsets and listen to some music while you run on the treadmill. That's a great way to process what's been happening as well. A lot of leaders do that, and at the same time, the physical benefits that you get from exercising on your alertness, your cognitive processes, etc., your stamina is just wonderful. So maybe we leave it at these three: journaling, meditation, exercise.
I think those are great examples. And I think just to like really hone in on the point of taking time to be, whether it is 2 hours in a week or 5 minutes in the morning or a week every quarter, even most of us get our best ideas in the damn shower. And it is because we are not distracted, right? And it's like in those moments, or maybe it is when we're running or when we're exercising, that sometimes the most clarity comes in the space when we're not doing. We are just in the presence of being. We're not distracted by anything else. So I think those are all really great examples, Fabrice. And typically we kick off every episode with asking the definition of what does consciousness mean to you. We're going to wrap up this episode with what is your definition of consciousness?
For me, it's being aware of our motivations. Why are we doing the things we do? And it's being aware of the consequences of our actions. So what happens if I do something? And not just looking at the short term, but looking at the long term, not just looking in the immediate vicinity, but looking at the broader consequences, right? So taking the big picture, that's for me, conscious leadership.
Love that. In such a full circle from where we started on what you see to be true and kind of where leadership is going or where it could or should be, all the way, your definition of consciousness is definitely a full circle of this conversation. So Fabrice, thank you so much for joining us, sharing your insights, your wealth of knowledge. And I hope everybody puts some time on their calendar to take a dang retreat.
Thank you, Amy. I've enjoyed it very much.
Before we wrap up this episode, here are my 3 takeaways from Fabrice and how we can incorporate them into our lives. Number 1, the universal truth of conscious leadership. No matter who it is that we've spoken to, and Fabrice has an extensive background in working with leaders closely in Asia for the last 20 years, but he's worked with leaders all over the world. And some of our other guests and my experience in working with leaders all over the world is that conscious leadership is this truth, this need, really this ongoing expectation, no matter where you're from. It doesn't matter the industry or the size company or the country that you might be working in. These facets of being a conscious human and a conscious leader, they're true and they're needed. Number 2, what idol are you serving? I know Fabrice said, what God are you serving? I think both of those are helpful to reflect upon. The 4 idols: money, fame, power, and pleasure. Is there one that we are making the main thing? Are we chasing purely to make more money or to be, have some level of notoriety or to feel as though we have made some position where we now have the ultimate power? Are we seeking something that is more pleasure-oriented. None of those are bad in and of themselves, but if we make those the main thing, we can guarantee we are not operating consciously. Number 3, how often are you taking time to just be? I love that he shared 2 hours a week, 1 hour a quarter. I think for some of us, that might sound extreme or radical. I want to personally work on that not sounding 1 ounce or 1 bit or iota extreme, that it is just a given of like, yeah, I looked at my calendar and I have a full week taken off every single quarter with no agenda, no, here's the things I'm going to get done around my house in replacement of, but really just time to be, to observe what's happening in my mind and in my body and to contemplate what would happen for you if you prioritized that. Thanks for listening to the Conscious Habit Podcast. If you dug this episode, we'd love it if you would subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. And if you're into this consciousness thing, if you like this conversation and you want to meet more like-minded people, head on over to Facebook and join the Conscious Habit community. Until next time, do the world a favor and go love yourself.